All right, Michael, the blue chip, red chip series is starting to come to an end over the next couple of weeks here, but we got some premier positions we got to get to before we wrap this thing up. And today, let's discuss the wide receivers, the pass catchers, the divas of the NFL, as some people say it. But before we get into all that, as we always do, we're going to set the criteria of what a blue chip and a red chip receiver is. How do you define those guys at the position?
Well, first of all, anytime you go into a draft room, there's 17,000 receivers that are draftable on a draft board. And, it's one of the hardest positions, I think, for scouts to evaluate. I think it's hard. It's really hard for fans to evaluate because there's such a disconnect between college football and pro football, in the sense that in college, everything's pretty much off coverage. Unless you're playing Alabama or some of the teams in the Southeast Conference, most everybody plays off coverage. So what does that mean? That means the receiver gets into the route with no hesitation. And he gets into his route. He gets to run his route. He gets to get to the top of his stem. He gets to break and separate. Well, when you get to the NFL, that's over with. Then nobody's getting free access just to run a route on every single play. So, it's hard to evaluate receivers if they can get away from that. Can they separate? And then I think what we have to really understand is it's really, really hard to be a number one receiver. It's really hard in the NBA to find a guy who can create his own shot. Mm-hmm. So a wide receiver and an NBA star are pretty similar. Like, who can create their own shot in basketball? Who can get to the rim whenever they want? Who can hit a 25-footer whenever they want based on dribble, penetration, stop? It's the same thing with outside receivers. It's hard to win on the outside in the NFL. You've got to be a really good player. You've got to have great quickness. You've got to be able to separate initially at the top, at the beginning of the route. You've got to be able to separate at the top of the stem and accelerate into it. And, oh, by the way, you got to catch the football when you get there. So it's not about who's the fastest, because that doesn't necessarily always translate. Mm-hmm. It's not always about who's the biggest. And it's not always about who has the most skins on the wall based on college of all these catches. I do think this, though, Femi. I do think over my career, I think what I've learned is, yes, it's an athletic position, but it's really about it's more about balance and eye-hand control and quickness than it is anything. And the other thing it's really about is instincts. And I think what you see is guys that don't have a lot of production in college. Now, look, I know there's some guys that play in offenses that, Demaryius Thomas didn't play in an offense at Georgia Tech that allowed him to make any plays. I get that. But there is a connection between your instincts as it translates to play the position. It is an instinctive position. So, what we try to do in our grading system is we try to, have a criteria, size, height, weight, and speed. We always had two positions. We had the big receivers, the guys that were not tight ends but really were not true X's or Z's, the big receiver, the mismatch receiver who could play inside. And then we had the nickel guy, the guy that could play in 11 but only inside. And when I say nickel, I don't mean third down. I mean when we're in 11 personnel. Again, I no longer refer to downs. Downs are meaningless. The old adage, we'll throw the ball on first down because it's easier to throw the ball. No, it's not, because teams play nickel. They play whatever their sub stuff. Yeah. Everything is personnel driven. So that 11 receiver has got to be able to win inside, win with quickness, and run with the ball after the catch. As Belichick stands in front of the team, look, playing receiver is not really hard. You got to get the fuck open, you got to catch the ball, and you got to run with it after the catch.
Yeah, no, and I think a lot of the guys on the list are able to accomplish that. But the receiver is among one of the money 5 positions that a lot of people talk about in team building, with quarterback, left tackle, pass rusher, and cornerback. And this summer, this offseason, was the offseason of the wide receiver. Do you think that this position has ascended to the second most valuable position just behind quarterback?
Well, I think you need playmakers. There's no denying it. What you need is guys that can advance the ball, run after the catch. But I think what we've seen is, if you're paying attention to the National Football League at all, is you're sitting there. If you're a general manager, you're saying, wait a minute, A.J. Brown was, a second-round pick? Debo was a late second. This guy was a third. Gabriel Davis was a fourth. Like, there's more inventory. And unless I can get an elite number one receiver, somebody that can win on the outside and is going to beat everybody and has innate toughness, and so I think it's you could sit there and say, okay, who's the difference? I wrote this for the betting guide. Like, if you go back and study George Pickens at Georgia, coming out of Hoover High School in Alabama, he commits to Auburn. He's a 5-star kid, productive in high school football. Then he flips and goes to Georgia. He enters the Southeast Conference, dominates, comes right in, has, I think, 40 catches as a junior, as a true freshman. And then as a junior, he gets an injury bug. Then the senior year in the spring, he tears his ACL and he can't really play. But you're talking about somebody who's big, somebody who's fast, somebody who's got quickness, somebody who's got really good hands, and somebody who's had production over time. And he goes to 52nd pick. Now, you and I both know, in this draft, there's going to be somebody picked in the second, third, or fourth round at receiver that's going to be better than the guys picked in the first.
Yeah.
And that's the challenge as a general manager or as an executive, is to be able to figure that one out. That's the one you got to figure out. Pittsburgh does a good job of it. Pittsburgh understands what they want, and they break it down really well. Some teams don't. You say, well, New England doesn't. I think that's probably true. New England has been all over the map when it comes to receivers, and they've eliminated some guys that were good just because of certain areas. And I think you want to be able to say, narrow it down. The other thing you got to do with some of these guys is, can they impact fourth down? Are they 4-down players? Which means, do they have a return game to them? Like Debo could really be a great kickoff returner. If you go back to South Carolina football history, he was incredible there. So, and one of the things I learned, the great Charlie Taylor played at the Washington football team, the Redskins. He wore number 42. Why? Because he was a running back at one time. Running backs in high school that go to receiver know what to do with the ball in their hands. One of the great things about Samuel is he really knows how to advance the ball when it's in his hands, and that's what separates him.
Do you think that we're in the golden age of wide receivers?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of guys. I think it is. And I think the way the rules are, where you can't chuck them. I mean, like some of these guys that played in the 50s and 60s, I mean, they were getting the shit beat out of them. The Gary Collinses and the Boyd Dowell, these guys that try to run in routes, they're just getting the crap beat out of them. They can't even get into the route. The 5-yard chuck rule wasn't in play. There was bump press coverage. You could mug the guy at the line of scrimmage. Now we're talking about really loosening the illegal contact rule. And when we do that, these guys are just going to be able to effortlessly flow into the flow of the game. It's going to be pretty easy for them.
Well, let's get into the list of the red chips here for the wide receivers. I think you brought up some excellent points there, especially with the rules allowing for these guys to get some more free releases or not as much contact down the field. But the red chips are as follows, Michael. Stefon Diggs of the Buffalo Bills, Deebo Samuel of the San Francisco 49ers, CeeDee Lamb of the Dallas Cowboys, Mike Evans of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and Mike Williams of the Los Angeles Chargers. Deebo is interesting. You brought him up and his prowess with the ball in his hands, but I was almost fascinated to see if Deebo would have been put into another category because he coined it wide back. He's a wide receiver running back here, but you see him more as a wide receiver.
Well, I think Debo's an inside guy. So if Deebo had to play, and people might disagree with it, but if Deebo had to play and live on the outside at X or Z and just stayed out there like Jerry Rice, not going to be as effective. But when he comes inside and he gets that ball in his hand on a short pass, I mean, the guy averaged 18.2 yards a catch, right? And when the ball went to him, he had a 63.6% percentage of catching the ball when it went to him. Now, he only had 6 touchdowns, receptions, only 6. So he's got, 121 targets, 77 catches, and 6 touchdowns. See, to me, to get into the Hall of Fame, that number's got to get closing down. That's one of the great things about the Randy Moss is, the more catches you get's great, but are we putting the ball in the end zone? We got to score. We got to win this game, And the other thing I thought that Deebo did a bad job of last year was he had 4 fumbles. I mean, he had 4 – the ball came out 4 times. But he's dynamic in terms of yards after the catch, and I think he's one of the best receivers in football. He's hard to tackle, and I think he'll continue to make plays because he's so dominant in terms of tackling.
Deebo Samuel was another guy who didn't go in the first round, but you have 3 first-round picks among the red chips in Lamb, Evans, and Williams. I want to focus in on CeeDee Lamb, not just because I'm a Dallas Cowboys fan, but I think it's a really interesting season for him as he's entering year 3, his age 23 season. This is going to be the first go-around for him as the undisputed wide receiver 1 out there in Dallas. What do you expect from Lamb?
Well, I think he's just going to get better and better. I mean, he averaged almost 14 yards. He had 6 touchdowns last year, in 79 catches, which is kind of similar to what Debo had too. He only averaged he averaged 14 yards a catch, which is pretty good. He's going to get a bunch more targets, and I think he can win. He can win inside and outside. He's got elite quickness, which I think is really going to help him. He's got elite quickness. He can separate, and he can run with the ball after the catch. He's 22 years old. He's only going to get better. I think he's got a lot ahead of him, and I think to label him a slot receiver is probably wrong. I thought his arrow's pointing way up.
Yeah, he's really effective out of the slot, but he's going to be playing more outside as well here now that Amari Cooper is in Cleveland, and Michael Gallup right now is probably going to start the year on the PUP list. Mike Evans, I think, has had an underrated season because when you look at his stats, he has been absolutely productive from the moment he stepped into the league. He's entering his 9th season. In the previous 8 years, 1,000-yard receivers seasons in every single one of them. Former first-round pick, like I mentioned. Now he's 29 years old. Evans is putting together a Hall of Fame caliber kind of career.
Well, if your mantra is I want the ball in the end zone based on catches, then this is your guy, right? I mean, he's got 14 touchdowns. He caught 74 passes. He's got a 65% catch ratio. So, he averages 14 yards a catch. He gets the ball down the field. He makes plays. I mean, Kyle Pitts, for all the fanfare, for being the greatest receiver, the tight end and all that, can you tell me how many touchdowns he had reception-wise last year, Fem?
I can because I looked it up when we did the tight ends last week.
He had one.
It was one.
He had one. Yeah. Let's ignore that. I didn't put DK Metcalf on this list, and I think DK Metcalf is, if you extend the Reds, you could say DK's better than, maybe he's better than Lamb. You could probably say that's right. He had 12 touchdowns. I mean, the guy had 12 touchdowns last year with inconsistent. Now, DK, 58.1% of the time, that was when his catch percentage was, which isn't great, right? That's not exactly what you want. But he was really doing good. So I just think, to me, Evans puts the ball in the end zone. I mean, he gets it into the end zone, and he makes plays. And because of, I think he's improved Brady's ability to throw the ball down the field.
Yeah. And I think some people might say, well, yeah, he gets the ball in the end zone because he has the greatest quarterback of all time throwing him the football. His rookie season, he had 12 receiving touchdowns back in 2014. I can't even remember who was playing quarterback for the Buccaneers back then. It was pre-Jameis Winston. So Evans has been really productive all throughout his entire career here, being able to get the ball into the end zone and also yardage, because like I mentioned, he's never had a season with less than 1,000 receiving yards, first 8 seasons of his career. You mentioned DK Metcalf as a guy that did not make the list here. There was quite a bit of high-profile guys who didn't make the list, and that's kind of why I asked you about, is this the golden age of the position? Because, I mean, look at A.J. Brown got a big deal this year, Terry McLaurin the same, Keenan Allen, Michael Thomas has been injured the past couple of years, but before then he was at that blue chip, red chip status. Amari Cooper, Cortland Sutton, DeAndre Hopkins, DJ Moore, Michael Pittman, Allen Robinson, Tyler Lockett, Chris Godwin. There's so many good receivers.
All good. Yeah, but they're not all number one receivers. We all think they are, but they're not. Like, A.J. Brown's not a number one receiver. A.J. Brown's a yards after the catch receiver. He's going to get rolled. A number one receiver is Tyreek Hill. You got to roll the coverage to him, okay? You got to roll the coverage to him. And if you don't roll the coverage to him, which is what they did last year, they didn't. They basically played off. It's funny, and I don't want to jump ahead to Tyreek Hill, but I was talking to a defensive coordinator in the league, and I was asking them about the impact of what is going to happen with, the Chiefs no longer having this guy on the outside. And the coordinator said he saw Kelsey at an event and went up to him and said, Kelsey, all you're going to see is press coverage from here on out. Because the coverage now is going to roll to Kelsey. It's not going to roll to Hill. See what I mean? So it's a different ball game. And all those guys you mentioned are really good players, but they're not all number one receivers. There's very few number one receivers. So you put them in a hat, you kind of mix them around. Could you say Metcalf's better than CeeDee Lamb? Maybe you're right. I think they're all kind of 65 players. I think Stefon Diggs is probably a little better than some of these guys in this category. Got 10 touchdowns. He was really productive, over 100 catches. So I think you just kind of – Samuel, to me, is probably an elite player in this category as well.
Yeah, Stefon Diggs had 4 straight 1,000-yard seasons, and I think Stefon Diggs is a really just interesting point of how a wide receiver can help a quarterback come along, because Josh Allen really exploded and developed when Stefon Diggs arrived in Buffalo. So while these wide receivers are high priced and all that, you see why some of these teams want to go out and get some of these big name guys, because it helps the quarterback improve as well and open up the entire offense, like you mentioned in Kansas City.
Yeah, I mean, and look, it's no secret that, when you watch the tape, the effect of the player, Beasley, Gabriel Davis, Yeah. Again, what we want is somebody who can win on the outside and create his own shot. That's what we want in number one receivers. And Diggs kind of does that. So the Gabriel Davises, the Cole Beasleys, those guys, the Isaiah McKenzies, they start to look better because all the attention's going out to Diggs.
Yeah, that's kind of the trickle-down effect of having one of these big-name receivers.
Yeah,
Stefon Diggs.
I mean, we didn't mention this guy, but Keenan Allen, I think, is really good. Don't get me wrong. Keenan Allen's a good player. But Mike Williams is the guy you fear. Mike Williams is who you fear. There's a reason why they paid Mike Williams this offseason. There's a reason why you worry about him. 15 yards a catch, 9 touchdowns, 76 catches. He only had a 58.9% catch percentage. That's got to improve, but he gets so many balls down the field. That's why that number isn't in the 70. He's not catching inside routes, where Keenan Allen's at 76%, 67%, but he only averages 10.7 yards a catch. You follow me? So there's a home run element to Mike Williams, and that's something that you get. Like Tyler Lockett, I mean, I could have easily made Tyler Lockett a red chip player. The guy had 73 catches last year, 8 touchdowns, averaged 16-1 a catch. And he played with some guys that weren't very good. Like Tyler Lockett's more of a red than Metcalf based on, Metcalf had 12 touchdowns, Lockett had 8. But Lockett's got 16.1 yards per catch.
Yeah, and Lockett also early on in his career was really good on the fourth down as well as a return man for the Seattle Seahawks. Real quick on Mike Williams, 4 straight seasons with 15-plus yards per catch. That goes to show you how consistent he is as a big play receiver. Thanks for watching the GM Shuffle with Michael Lombardi, and for more videos like this, make sure to subscribe to VSiN Live and the GM Shuffle podcast with Michael Lombardi, presented by DraftKings and VSiN, wherever you get your podcasts.